Hi, welcome everyone to our teaching pedagogy. Thank you guys so much for coming, and thank you to our special guests today, Dr. Hunt and Mr. Matcham. Could you guys please take a second to introduce yourselves?
Um, you want like a brief biography or something like that?
Yeah, sure, that'd be great.
Um, so I started clarinet when I was about 22, and so I took a music ed degree at Virginia Commonwealth University, and then I got a master's at Manhattan School of Music and a doctorate at Juilliard. And then while I was in New York, I did a lot of freelancing, and then I started teaching in universities and everywhere I lived. I tried to do as much playing as possible because I love to play music, of course. And then after a while, I became a public school teacher, and I taught like high school through elementary school, and have a private studio. I still have always continued to play my clarinet as much as possible. I really like to do chamber music, but I've also played in a lot of orchestras, and that's a lot of fun too. And I love teaching.
Yeah, thank you. That sounds great. Um, and Mr. Matcham, could you introduce yourself as well?
I am director of bands at Centennial High School, and I've been there for 11 years. I'm a trained trumpet player by trade. So my undergraduate degree is in performance, and my master's degree is in music education. I went to Oberlin and then got my master's at Peabody. And some of you are familiar faces to me, obviously.
And when did you go to Oberlin?
I graduated in 2007.
Oh, okay. Because I worked there from 1990 to 1993.
Okay.
Great school.
All right, and I think you guys both have different perspectives when it comes to teaching because Dr. Hunt, if I understand correctly, you now teach private clarinet lessons, while Mr. Matcham, your focus is directing bands at Centennial High School. So I think it'll be really interesting hearing both of your perspectives. To start this pedagogy off, my first question for both of you is, what's your favorite memory when it comes to teaching?
You want to go ahead because I answered first on the other one, or
Sure. Um, so mine's actually more related to private trumpet teaching. But I've had a number of students that have had serious technical struggle with the instrument. And in particular, there was a student who started with me really young in like fourth or fifth grade and had a lot of technical issues for an extended period of time. And I think that there were a number of teachers and or other private teachers that they weren't right for the instrument or the instrument wasn't right for them. And I stuck with them, and it was a tough road of like 2 or 3 years of like kind of being behind their peers. Um, and then, kind of after sticking with them for a while and revamping some of the ways they were playing, they ended up being super successful. And for me, that's kind of was a learning experience because I do think that sometimes, especially in music, we're guilty of thinking people can or can't. Either they've got it or they don't got it. And I think there's an element of that perhaps. But as a teacher, I always think, can I make them better? And can they be an active participant in that? So great looks different for each individual person. So for this specific student I'm thinking of, they ended up getting into All-State and things like that, which is something that I think that they thought was not in the cards for them when they were starting. And I think that other people felt the same way when just listening to them play. And I think that their technical abilities on the instrument is kind of what held them back. One of my teachers used to say sometimes you can tell that people are prisoner to the instrument. And there's actually like a great musician in there, but they struggle with something. And I think as teachers, it's our responsibility to figure out how to help them overcome that. because sometimes the challenge is playing the instrument and not the musicianship.
Thank you. I think that's an amazing mindset to have as a teacher, and I mean, I wish I had a music teacher like that. Dr. Hunt, what's your favorite memory?
I don't know if I can bring it down to one, but I really appreciate what Mr. Manson said. I mean, the um, the satisfaction we get to see the students blossom both musically and on their instrument, and uh, sometimes it's unlocking the instrument, or the like the person is like wrapped up in tension, or like in an armor, and just to learn how to relax and play and understand that, but also like the musical part. So I don't know if I can isolate it to one, because when my students, just when they get better, it's really satisfying to me and of course to them. So uh, when they win a competition, that's great, or get in all state. So I actually just love teaching anyway. So anyway, I might be getting ahead of what you're going to talk about.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's super important as instructors to always keep in mind the progress rather than results, and I think you guys both nailed on that. Now my second question before letting other people ask questions is, I guess Mr. Matchim, you already kind of answered this, but do you have any personal philosophies when it comes to teaching music?
Yeah, I mean, I touched on it a bit. I think that um, there's two things that you have to think about when you're teaching someone, and it's the musicianship and then it's the actual mechanical playing the instrument. And those two things work hand in hand. Um, I think that there are people that are prisoner to their instrument. I also think that there are people who have the skills on the instrument, but then that musicianship is the challenging piece. It's very rare you find someone that has both, that just naturally does those two things. But I don't think those things coming easy is necessarily a determinant of success. Um, of some of my colleagues that, I'm not playing in a professional orchestra, nor do I consider myself to play at that level. But the people that I talk to that I went to school with, actually, like a large number of them that are now successful in careers aren't the ones that just found it easy in college. They were the people that actually I associate their success more with their personality than their like innate ability. The people that I went to school with that are doing amazing things are because they were persistent and never gave up. Um, and so, I think that my teaching philosophy is that working hard is the first thing, and then it's what you're working hard at. I think that's the next important piece for success. There are no shortcuts. Musicians for centuries have tried to find the quickest way to being able to do something well, and then unfortunately, it's not a very fast process. So yeah.
I think I agree in a way. There's no shortcuts. However, there's a mindful and skillful path to learning to play that I'm sure Mr. Manson does. Like, um, what's the most efficient way to unlock, as you were saying, to unlock that being a slave to the instrument? So, and also um, encouraging, like, how to, like skillful teaching, and really understanding like how the brain works of whatever age student you're working with. Like the adolescent, like everyone except Mr. Manchin and I are adolescents, I think. So that your brain, when you're, you know, at that age, is a certain, it tends to be a certain level of maturity, and um, certain processes are taking place. So, and understanding how to, use that knowledge, I think that's really helpful. And like sometimes I might say, you played that wrong, when it would be better to say, okay, this time focus on the rhythm, or maybe count and clap before you play or something, rather than, yeah, your rhythm sucks. Which sometimes I want to say that though, and sometimes I do say that, like if they haven't done their work. So,
Yeah, I was going to chime back in and say, I mean, I think the hardest thing as a teacher, and this is kind of goes into my philosophy of teaching, is like meeting someone where they're at and helping them get better. And I think sometimes, and I still consider myself a young teacher, um, I probably will feel that way forever, but I think when we're looking at a player or a musician, we have to think about what they can do and how to bring them a little bit further rather than think about what they can't do. Um, as a trained musician, when I listen to a player or in my world, I listen to a band, I hear thousands of things that I want to be better. And you have to kind of figure out where you're going to get the biggest bang for your buck. What's the biggest problem you need to fix at that time? And how much information you share with the student so they feel like whatever you're wanting them to do is achievable, right? I can stand in front of a band and say, this was out of tune, this was wrong, this was wrong, this was wrong, this is not balanced, this is sticking out, you're sticking out, this is what, and I can do this all day long. But that can become overwhelming. So it's like, how do you kind of filter through all of that and then figure out that one thing you want to get better at? Um, and I'll use this as a quick little plug. There's a book out there called Peak, P-E-A-K, and it's the expertise of practice. And actually, it starts with a prologue about musicians learning music, and it's using the way musicians practice or should practice as a model for coaching for a lot of athletics, actually. But it talks about how people can really only think about one thing and really improve on that one thing at that given time. Now, obviously, as musicians, we have to multitask constantly. That's what makes being a musician challenging. But we don't teach people with the start of multitasking 8 million things, right? Asking in my world, asking a ninth grader to think about blend, pitch, balance, phrasing, their air support, all of those things at once is too much. So you have to think about how you structure that so that they know what they're working on every time they do something and they make it better.
Yeah, thank you. As a high school tutor myself, I found that when it comes to teaching younger kids especially, I have to be really careful with my words and the ideas that I want to deliver at them at a time. And it's cool to see how that applies to like older musicians as well and adolescents, and as a band director when you're addressing like a large group of students. Does anyone else in this room have any questions about teaching music? I'll give like five
I have a
seconds.
question. Okay.
Yes.
Hello. I have a question. Hi. Um, so what you just said about like meeting someone halfway. Sorry, I just realized that I was like on mute that entire time. So I really hope I was loud or anything. So apologies about that. Um, but what you just said about meeting someone like where they're at and then helping them get better. Um, how do you know how can you like measure how much you can help them get better as an excuse of just pushing them? Like, how do you know the difference between pushing someone and over or asking too much or pushing them too much, especially with younger players specifically?
what do you play?
I play flute.
Oh, but what was the last part of your question? Specifically, you said a certain
Oh,
kind.
specifically with younger players, like
I just
below
think
high school.
you get to know the person that you're teaching. Like we're talking about one-on-one teaching, and so you're developing a relationship with that person, and so it's kind of like you just said, knowing when they've had enough, and sometimes you teach a concept and the student's picking it up, and then suddenly it's kind of too much information, and so the way learning works is if you show them the concept, work with them a little bit, and it seems like you're pressing too hard, or they're not progressing, then just put it away and they can come back later and the brain will have processed it in the meantime.
Would that be
So
the same answer for like a larger setting, like a full ensemble setting, like not one-on-one?
I think so. Although, like Mr. Man, I mean, it's a different dynamic because you're dealing with several people, like a band, and Mr. Manager can speak to this more expertly than I, but you have a range of students in the band. Some probably don't practice very much, and some probably are very serious and in between. So that's almost an art form, just part of the art of teaching to plug into that. But just that you ask that question means you're aware of it. So good.
Yeah, I was going to say that I think trying to find a way to challenge people without over challenging them is just trial and error, and it's based on your relationship with that individual person. And I have the same experience with larger ensembles, finding out where that sweet spot is. Now, I think the way you figure out that sweet spot is we're in this wonderful field where we get an immediate response of some sort of performance that shows us whether or not someone understands something. And I think of two different things I teach. I teach band and trumpet, and then I also teach music theory. And I actually find music theory really, really hard to teach because I will say something and I will lecture and I will give an explanation. And I ask, does this make sense? And you get this blank stare sometimes, and sometimes you get nods. And you don't find out it didn't make sense until they do some sort of test or assignment, like a couple days later. We're in this wonderful world where, as teachers, we say something, and then typically the person performs right after. And I think if the person is achieving what you're asking them to do, then you're finding that then they're getting it, right? You're approaching them where they're at. The moment you start giving them comments and you start noticing that like what you're asking for isn't happening, I think it can be one of two things as a teacher. You have to think about, okay, do I need to say it a different way to help them understand? And then if you try it 4 or 5 or 6 different ways, sometimes you still have to percolate. They have to percolate. You come back a week later, you try it again. Sometimes it's they're not ready. Sometimes it's you're not ready as a teacher, right, to explain that. But I think that that immediate response is what tells you if they're getting better, right? I think teachers in general, just not music teachers, are too quick to assume sometimes that people aren't trying, and that they need to work harder. I'm guilty of that 100%. There are times that I give information to students and I know that I've explained it clearly. I know that they just have to put in the work. And that's when I use that, you need to practice more or you need to work harder. But generally, I come from a place of, let me give you another way to think about it and see if it gets better. So I think that that immediate response of whether or not they're improving is kind of key. And if you're not getting the improvement, either you're not making sense or it's above them. And I think about things like for trumpet embouchure stuff, the way you use your lips is really challenging. And I can have a student from 4th grade, and I try to touch on things with their embouchure for years. And then finally in 7th grade, they're like, oh, I get it now. And it's partly because they're more coordinated. They were ready for that information. I didn't change anything about the way I explained it. It's just they were ready for it. Right. And I think that's kind of the challenge. I know, like flute, especially, sometimes the way people produce their sound on the flute, it needs so much work. And they're sometimes not ready for it yet. So it's tough. Teaching's not a science, it's an art. But we're lucky we get that immediate feedback.
Thank you.
Can I ask a question? I'm gonna ask a question. Okay, so both of you probably like have a lot of students to manage, right? I know as a private teacher, you might have like 10 to like 30, maybe even more in a private studio, or at least like a couple kids. And then as a band director, you have like a lot more kids to manage at once. How do you make sure everyone is doing okay? Like, how do you keep up with everyone? Do you like go to bed at night thinking, okay, this person next lesson I'm going to tell them to work on thirds. This person, I should ask if they try to get them in touch with lessons. Like, how do you balance everyone?
Well, in private lessons, I have the students keep a notebook, and so we write down what they're working on, not only what like the music assignments and ways to think about the music, but in the technical things and um, maybe flat chin, or I might have them write that in big letters. And then when they come back to the lesson, I look, I cheat, kind of, I guess. I have them keep the records. When it was on Zoom for a year, I kept the records and sent them to the students. Like I kept notes during the lesson. But, and I think, like I have maybe 16 students or so, so it's not that many. And, and I like all my students, so I know what's going on with them. So I'm very lucky to have kind of a small studio like that.
Right.
Yeah, I was going to say my private studio is smaller at this point. A few years ago, I had 16 to 20, but I'm slowly kind of backing away as my responsibilities increase at school. Uh, I have students keep an individual journal. I grew up with the same thing and took notes at my own lessons. And now I have a shared Google Doc that I have with students that I go in lessons, I take notes. And that actually started pandemic for me because I used to have people do it on their own and bring their journal to every lesson. And then when we started doing virtual lessons, I found it easy to kind of put things into a Google Drive document and share it with them. View only, so they can't change their assignments. I made that mistake once. And as far as in a larger setting, I mean, I do things, I think, I can't say I do things differently because I'm not in anyone else's band, but typically speaking, I make people turn in a lot of recordings of them playing individually. And I hate to break the news because some of these people are my own students, but I think most students think it's there to make people practice. And I think that there's an element of playing assignments that's, gets people to practice. But also for me, it's largely an assessment tool so that I can hear individual players. And that's something that I think in larger ensemble settings is lost. When you're in a professional group, the professionals generally are going to hold themselves accountable and make sure that they play well. And they know what they're doing. That's why they're there. And, younger academia and secondary primary, sometimes the people sitting in the seat think they're doing it right. And then they turn in a recording and then I'm 60 to 80 people in a band at once. And so I get the recording and I'm like, yeah, that's not right. And so it's more, while it is an incentive for people to practice, it's actually a tool for me to kind of see what I need to fix in band the next week. So yeah, for me, and you get to hear your individual players all the time when you're a private teacher. But for me, I mean, by the time students leave my program, as some of you know, I know you're playing. I could hear you play, and among, one clarinet among 30, and I could tell you which clarinet player it is, because I've heard them play individually throughout their whole 4 years.
Right.
Sorry. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. If there's anyone like in particular that's struggling, do you like, how do you try to get students better? Like, do you reach out to them and put them in contact with like private tutors, or do you say like practice more or something like that? So that way there's not such like a disparity between the like better players and the worst players, I guess.
Dr. Hunt was going to chime in there for a second, so I'm going to let him chime in and then go from.
Thank you. Thank you. I think this question is really more for you, Mr. Manchin. But I just wanted to ask you to follow up on the Google Docs that you keep with your private students. Do you think that's an advantage over having them bring their notes to the lesson? And I mean, one good thing about them keeping notes is when they actually write them, that reinforces it. But I just wondered if you thought Google Docs had a certain advantage as well.
Yeah, great question. So I primarily use the Google Doc just to keep track of the assignment itself and not like all the individual tips or things like that. The journal that students keep is what they record that like instructional advice in. I also prefer that they write it in a manuscript book because I write a lot of exercises and things that are tailored to individual people, right? And I'm sure you do the same. And if someone's struggling with something, then you're like, okay, I have an idea. You should do this. And it's nice to have manuscript paper to be able to write it out because then you don't have to hunt for a book. So I still like the journal and manuscript paper for the majority of things. But for me, I always have my phone with me. And so if I'm teaching a student at their house or teaching virtually, or they're at, my studio, I can use my phone and keep track of their assignments. So that there's a level of accountability when a student sits, I think, and they sit down in the first minute in your lesson and you say, okay, today we're listening to X scales, this etude, and these solos. Let's roll. Where I definitely, as a student in high school, pulled fast ones on my teacher. And sometimes I was like, yeah, I don't remember us doing that. Or like, hopefully he won't remember that I was supposed to work on Muller 5 this week. And so, I think the Google Doc is there more of accountability. And then the journal is the instructional tool. So I guess I'll continue with what Alan's question about what you do with that information when people are struggling. So in an ensemble setting, say if I have 70 students, depending on the ensemble, I would say I have probably like 20 people that are cooking and can do anything I put in front of them. And then I have the middle, and then I have the bottom. And the bottom being people who are not playing as well either because they're not practicing or they don't understand, etc. For me, I make myself available for help during lunch and individual stuff. There are a lot of players that I provide individual feedback. I do recommend private lessons sometimes, but I actually find that the best way to get someone to get private lessons is sometimes if you meet with them privately and you share with them some individualized information that makes them better. And then I usually say, okay, I'm a trumpet player and I just helped you with that on the saxophone. Do you see how valuable it would be for you to be with a saxophonist every week? And then they're usually like, yeah. And that's actually, I've had more success with students going to private teachers because of that, rather than me just saying you should get a private teacher. Because I think unless they have that one-on-one experience that they benefit from, some of them don't see the benefit of the private teacher. And I'm always careful to highlight, like, I'm a trumpet player and I do have a good deal of knowledge pedagogically about all the instruments, but I mean, nothing's going to beat someone who's a specialist on the instrument. I think I focus my time on the middle a lot. Just last week, I talked to like a bunch of student leaders. I'm into geeky leadership books and things. And I think in any organization, you got 20 or 30% at the top, if you're lucky, that are really working hard all the time and get it. And then there's the people who are the low 10 to 15% that are not as engaged, not practicing, who knows why they're there. They could be there because their parent makes them, etc. And then there's the middle. And the middle are the people that can go either way. If you give them, something to get excited about and give them music they like and good feedback that they feel like they're getting better, then they kind of start working really hard. The people who are in the bottom 10 to 15%, I get to usually have people for 4 years. I spend a lot of time trying to get what they gain an understanding of how they tick. Sometimes people want to feel respected and they just want to feel like you value them, and then you see them start to work harder. So the mechanical thing on their instrument, they need some individual work and advice there. Some of them just have the capability to do it, but need to practice. And I think the relationship is the key there. And I think that's, Dr. Hunt would probably say the same thing about private students. I've had private students before that I thought hated the lessons, and then I find out like a year later that the parents like, oh, this is their favorite hour of the week, and I'm thinking like, really? Like, it doesn't, they're not practicing and all these things. Like, oh no, they love it. And then somewhere along the line, if we just keep working at it, they eventually jump on the bandwagon, for lack of a better phrase.
Um, I have a question as well. Um, okay, so there was a little bit earlier, there was talk about like students being like prisoner to their instrument. And I think like as a French horn player, you see that like pretty often. So like, how do you deal with that, like with younger and older students? Because I've definitely worked with like high school students through elementary school students. So like, how do you like go about that?
I think for clarinet, there's a very efficient way to play, and I think you can look at the anatomy and the physics of actually playing the instrument and what so the efficient way of playing, the skillful way of playing the instrument, and with younger students, uh, especially beginners, it's very easy to start them correctly. With older students who come with um, unskillful habits, that I think it's showing them the right way. Once again, not really focusing on what's wrong, but how you do it correctly. Like with clarinet, the chin, in my opinion, the embouchure and especially where the chin is very important. So we talk about how it's supposed to look, use a mirror, do videos to get feedback to just so the student can understand the correct way. So once again, like thinking about how the brain learns, I think it's more useful to develop new habits. Like you can show them what's incorrect, especially on the outside of the face, like in the throat or uh, inside the mouth. It's not as obvious. So, but just having different exercises to help them understand the correct way to play. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does make sense. Like choosing specific things to focus on, so you can like help them work on it, I guess.
Encouraging them, like um, focus on what needs to be done to be a better player than what you're doing wrong. Even though it's helpful to see, like if someone's slouched over playing, it's helpful for them to see that, look how you look. Here's the way it should look, the way your body is designed to function.
Yeah, I was going to say, especially for brass, I think it can be a struggle if the embouchure doesn't work, especially on horn. And I've had private students before that came to me and couldn't make a sound. And I think for me, the biggest challenge is usually um, uh, those people are often not aware that they have to fix the simplest thing in order to do the other thing. An example is like the classic fourth grader that wants to play Mary Had a Little Lamb, but like really can't buzz or produce a sound that's stable enough to do that. But they have this all this enthusiasm that they want to learn more and go faster and play high. And you're like, whoa, 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 we can't do that until we do this. And I think that's the challenge of teaching because you're teaching people. Um, an old student of mine is teaching privately in the area now and very talented and went to Juilliard and all these things. And he reached out and was like, how do you deal with people that you know what they need to fix and they just don't want to fix it? And I said, well, that's teaching. Unfortunately, it's this element of, I can look at a trumpet player and know that really what they need to do is play a G for like a week and learn how to make the sound and embouchure work for a G first. And that's like it. But telling a fourth grader that they have to practice a G for the week and just get a G to come out, that's pretty demoralizing to them. So it's kind of that earlier we were saying meet them where they're at. Um, Sometimes you have to give up on some of your expectations as a musician teacher temporarily to kind of get people hooked and then sneak in those other things later. At least that's my experience, because if a kid is really struggling with tone production and embouchure, and I'm saying you can't go further at all until you fix this, do not pass go, do not collect $200. While from a pedagogical standpoint of how they should learn to play the instrument makes sense, it doesn't make sense because they're a person that wants to feel like they're moving forward. And finding the way to balance those things, I think, is the biggest challenge. Does that kind of make sense, Kaitoya?
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah, it's not perfect. I wish I knew the quick answer, but it's definitely like it's a balance. Especially horn's a tricky one.
I agree.
Thank you to both of you. It's really interesting to hear about how it applies to different instruments. And I, like, as an oboe player, I definitely agree that understanding the instrument's anatomy itself and trying to tackle like the basic elements of that is definitely like something that all tutors should watch out for. Does anyone else have any questions?
Yeah, I have a question.
Oh, okay, Jay, you can go first.
Okay. So how do you choose music for a student or ensemble? Specifically, how do you choose something that sort of showcases someone's strengths while also like working on more of their weaknesses as well?
Well, I like the music to be fun for them, to develop the fundamentals at the same time. So I found a couple clarinet methods that I think fill that role, and and being a private teacher, I think maybe they're more enthusiastic about music and repertoire. I mean, I try to cultivate that in them. I think it's probably really different in a large ensemble. So in terms of repertoire, like clarinet has a standard repertoire, and it's not that big compared to like horn, I imagine, because horn's been around a lot longer than clarinet, and so I mean we have a lot of great music for clarinet, but not like to match piano or violin. So there's kind of a golden path of repertoire for every level. And like, it's all, some of it, a lot of it is really beautiful. So to have the student be enthusiastic, like hearing great players play it, to know that they can sound like that. So that's how I think about it.
Yeah, in an ensemble setting, I think about obviously the skills of the group and the different sections and things. I also look at what the challenges are in the music. I think there's some musical challenges that are easier to teach and learn than others. For example, a lot of times people think fast notes are like the hardest thing in the world. And as a band director, for better or worse, I generally don't think that is the thing that's challenging. And so sometimes something sounds hard, but it's not. It just takes starting it slow and speeding up. And then I think about, something that I think about, especially with my upper group, is where we are musicianship wise, where we are intonation wise, and things like that. And I think about that when I program. There are groups that I've had that I know that have an innate ability to play in tune and to phrase, and it can be very artistic. And I have groups that I think are more driven by technical passages because they feel more challenging. It's sometimes I miss the mark. Sometimes I feel like I nail the programming. It's challenging. I think of, and then the final thing is the stuff I select is a balance of challenging without over challenging, and thinking about the things that I need the group to learn. I'm already thinking about, I'm not going to name any pieces because some of you are here, but I'm already thinking about pieces for next year, to not talk about you like you're not in the room, but I want to get our intonation and our just general artistic nuance back that existed pre-pandemic. And I think that I'm going to have to think carefully about how that's programmed earlier in the year, because I often think about where I want the group to be, right? Like I think about where I want the group to be in March and what I have to do to get us there. And that was a challenge this year because after a year and a half of away, everyone comes back. They remember the group they were before. They're a different group now, different strengths, different weaknesses. So yeah, I think about the long game as well. Because the first time I do a slow piece can't be in March. And I have to think about what difficulty of slow piece I have to do in October that's gonna, be a teaching tool, but get us where we need to be. So I think that's the challenge for me.
Thank you so much. I definitely agree with like, especially for younger kids, I feel like the repertoire you give them has to be fun in a way because obviously you still want them to stay engaged, but it's really hard as not an experienced like not like a professional experienced musician to measure where they are at and then try to give them the music that'll also allow them to progress while still having fun. And it's really great to hear that from your perspective where it's like you're teaching as a professional instructor, but you're still having some of the same struggles as us. Amy, I believe you had a question.
Yeah, but I think Dr. Han was about to say something.
Well, I just wanted to throw some information out there because I guess you're all teaching privately or thinking about doing that. Like, do you all have students or one student? Yeah. Okay. I would just suggest that as far as helping students develop basic skills in, in a private setting, is to use a drone and have them play all kinds of exercises, unison, octaves, fifths, even the scale, hearing a major, second in tune, because it's easy to get, it's easy to play out of tune, like to not be playing an even scale, because the acoustic instruments are not in tune, at least the woodwinds. I guess the brass, the overtones are more in tune, like on a good brass instrument, but like with oboe, clarinet, and bassoon, those instruments are not in tune. So, but we have to play them in tune. So anyway, so I really try to get I have some advanced students who play beautifully, but they don't really play in tune. So, I shamed one into using the drone, and now she's so happy because you can really hear when it's in tune. So, thank you for letting me say that.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, for oboe, I know like I have so much trouble just like being in tune all the time with intonation, and I'm glad you pointed that out because it goes like specifically for woodwind, and I think brass instruments as well.
Like when you're playing an excerpt of music in a certain key, you can have your drone on the tonic, but you also can have it on the dominant because the tonic dominant relationship is like the basis of music, of our Western music. So anyway, yeah, and it helps me too as a player because it's easy to kind of get a little out of touch. So
Yeah, definitely. Amy, what is your question?
Yeah, so obviously, like, you should have different expectations for different students, like, based on what age they're at. But right now, I have one student, and since I can only base off what my expectations should be based off, like, where I was at her age, I'm wondering how you know when your student should be playing better than the level that they're at, or if the level that they're at is, like, good. So just, like, when do you know when your expectations should get higher or lower? But yeah, like, both ways.
I think that your expectations should always be increasing for the student. I mean, I don't know if you can compare how you were to how that when you were that age to that student because you're a different person. But I always expect them to constantly be growing, wherever they are. Like my thing that I love about teaching is wherever the student is, to see them grow in their ability to play and their love of music.
Yeah, I would say there's an expectation for growth. Um, Over the years, I think when I first started teaching both privately and ensemble setting, I had an idea of like the band should be here or this is where they should be there. I don't really think about it that way anymore. I don't think of it in comparison. I don't think of it as a benchmark. Um, I think of just, yeah, the expectation of growth for that individual student because setting that expectation, I don't really know what it, it setting some arbitrary expectation of where someone should be after X number of years playing, for me just doesn't make sense anymore.
Right.
And I don't think that that means that I don't have high expectations because I think I have very high expectations for growth. That I want to see people progressing regularly. But I mean, I think of it in terms of my own band, right? I'm looking to be better today than yesterday and better tomorrow than today. Me saying you should be perfectly in tune right now. What is that? I mean, that would be beautiful, but like that imposition of that expectation, I don't think makes that expectation come to fruition any faster because the issue is that you need to get them to grow. So I kind of have changed that mindset. I actually read a book called Mindset. That's growth mindset. And less about where people should be and more about where they are and helping them get better. I think if you
Yeah,
think
that's
they
really,
should be, oh, sorry. I
yeah,
was gonna
yeah,
say
that's helpful.
I think you
Yeah.
can get yourself in trouble because like as a trumpet player, if I think, oh, they should be able to play a high A by eighth grade. Well, if
Hmm.
they're only playing a C, if I'm pushing them to play a high A, because I think they should be there, I'm actually going to probably create more mechanical, technical, fundamental problems than if I help them grow at a gradual pace. Think about it like practicing a scale. You may want your scale to go bum, and go that fast, and they're starting at bum, 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 bum. Well, just saying it needs to be faster, this is my expectation. I don't know what that is.
Hmm.
It doesn't make it happen any faster.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Thank you.
Speaking of mindset, is there any like specific philosophies or mindsets you try to teach to your students? Like any life lessons outside of the instrument that, yeah.
I think my relationship with the students is all about the complete person. So um, I care about them as a person as a luxury because it's a one-on-one thing. So does that answer your question? I'm not sure.
Um, I'm not really like about like how to deal with like maybe if they like lost a competition, how not to like compare yourself with other people, just stuff that kind of stuff like that, I guess.
Um, well, a lot of my students lose competitions and a few win. And so it's specifically about competitions. There's a huge issue with judging. Like how were the judges of that particular competition? And they might even be really good judges, but that doesn't mean I agree with them. You know, like if I hear the competition, one of my students beats the student that I thought played better. I mean, that's very subjective, but um, I try to talk with the students and always about going back to growing. Like, you're playing this fantastic music. Just being able to play the music is really wonderful. I mean, you could be like doing math or something. Maybe you think that's fun too. That's okay. But, you're doing music and it's so wonderful and you're growing and you played your best. And, you know, there's a famous saying, the best player doesn't win. So as far as like that kind of disappointment, even so, I don't really have an expectation that they win. I just hope that they will win. I hope they will go in and play their best. We talk about preparation for the performance, things you can do like with nerves or physically to get ready. And so afterwards, we might check in whether they win or lose. Well, how did that go? Did how did your preparation go? How did you feel while you were playing? So I guess that would be the winning, which is fantastic, isn't the main reason we're there. Like, I think going back to just like, we're all musicians. I mean, to me, that's like the best thing you can be as a musician, like for a job or just for something to do. So we're just lucky we're here talking about music. Okay, I'm getting carried away. I'm sorry.
I was going to say the biggest thing, so I think trying to get my students to have that growth mindset as well is something I think about. Celebrating improvements. I think that people usually set the benchmark as being perfect. And if you think that you're trying to achieve perfect every day, you're going to be disappointed every day. So trying to get in this idea that you're seeking growth every day and every year, I think is important. And then as far as musical things that we learn from music that I think other places may teach us, but especially in music, I really believe in honesty with like each other and ourselves. And I want, as a product of that, I expect my students to be pretty durable in the sense that like I should be able to tell you what to do better, and you not to get upset about that. I feel like I'll try to keep it very brief, but I feel like as people, we are very, very, very sensitive. And I think that's for a lot of reasons, but I think sometimes our own sensitivity can get in the way of our growth. And what I mean by that is we have to be able to accept feedback and take it seriously and also look at ourselves through an honest lens. That's something that I think about, I want from my students. And it's something that I have an expectation for myself. If I tell someone that's out of tune, you need to do this, we can't get upset about that. That's my role in telling you to do something better. And then it's a huge life skill to be able to listen to that and say, yeah, I need to do that, and then try to do it. So that's something that I think about a lot with my students. I don't think honest means being mean at all. There are times I think I can be very, very direct. But I also think, sometimes honesty is just not telling them something that they want to hear because it's easier. Sometimes you have to say what they need to hear because they need to grow. And I want the same for me, and that's how I look at myself. I'm my own worst critic. Yeah, I hope that kind of adds on to that and helps answer your question. I apologize. Usually I'm in bed by like 8:30 on a Sunday night, so y'all are keeping me past my
8:30.
bedtime. Yeah, I
So
usually get up for
early.
jazz, but I know
My
my jazz
God.
band doesn't start at 6:30 anymore, and it's like Una scheduled this, and I was like 8 o'clock. I'm supposed to give coherent answers at 8 o'clock at night. I'm like in bed, but so I apologize if I rambled. Um,
No, it's okay. That was really insightful. I think that was a very good piece of advice. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you,
And
Ellen,
I
for
and
that
I will
question.
say, sorry, yeah, I was gonna say, I do think people notice. Like I have people come in and work with us, and I had a student teacher this um, fall that was like, yeah, the clarinet. It's not specifically the clarinet or J, but the clarinet is out of tune. But I didn't want to say anything to them because I didn't want to hurt their feelings. And I was like, but how are you supposed to teach them if you can't be honest? Well, I think it might hurt their feelings. Well, if it hurts their feelings, then we deal with that after. That's the teachable moment, right? The teachable moment is I told you you're out of tune and you're upset. It's not I'm sorry I told you were out of tune. It's how do I coach you through this? You accept that you're out of tune and make it better and not judge yourself for it, right? I think sometimes as teachers we miss what the teachable moment is in something like that. And so I think that people have come in and then the student teacher the next day said, clarinet, you're sharp on this note. And the clarinet player went, oh, okay. And it was it. Now, I think they're used to that because they're used to me and my co-director. But I do know there are places that people are not as receptive to that type of feedback. And I sometimes get a rude awakening when I say something like the first clarinets got together, and then I get vicious side eye from the first clarinets. And I'm like, okay, calm down now. Sorry, I'm coaxing on the clarinets. And also, as a fun fact, Jay's a clarinet in my band. So I'm not just talking about Jay.
Uh, Thank you, Alan, for the question, and thank you to both of you for answering. I think to add on to both of your answers from the last question, um, I've always grown up with the mindset that as a musician or as a student, I always have to achieve stuff. I always have to get first place, whatever. And for music specifically, I think it's really toxic to sustain that mindset, especially if you're trying to grow. Because it's like if you keep measuring your success or worth based on how many competitions you win, you're not really gonna get anywhere. And my teacher always stressed to me, to think about the music itself and think about the value of being a musician. And from a young age, I think it'd be really valuable for elementary school students when they're first starting music to realize that from the beginning. So thank you both for mentioning that. Before we end today's teaching pedagogy, I did want to take a photo of this. So if people who have their cameras off could turn on their cameras. Yeah, thank you, Alan, for the thumbs up. Okay, and I'm going to take a screenshot in 3, 2, 1. Oh wait, let's get one more. 3, 2, 1. Yay! Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much to Dr. Hunt and Mr. Matchim for coming, and all of you guys for being great participants. Thank you. Have a good night.
It was a lot of fun. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Kaitoya, you
you.
had your Oh, I was going to talk to Kaitoya.
Oh,
Okay. It's
thank
okay.
you. Bye.